Willkommen zum Webinar Microsoft Teams, Security and Governance von CYCL. Schön, dass Sie mit uns an diesem frühen Abend in diesem Webinar teilnehmen. Wenn ich von wir spreche, mein Name ist Urs Wermelinger, ich leite das Marketing bei CYCL. Ich werde Sie kurz einführen ins Webinar und auch am Schluss dann wieder begleiten, wenn wir durch den technischen Teil oder durch den Produktteil durch sind. Michele Casazza wird uns durch die Demo und den inhaltlichen Teil leiten. Er ist bei CYCL tätiger Senior Cloud Consultants und einer unserer fähigsten Office 365 und Teams Consultants. Erlauben Sie mir noch 2, 3 Worte vorneweg zum Webinar selber, ein bisschen Housekeeping. Wir haben alle Teilnehmer stumm geschaltet. Sie haben aber die Gelegenheit, in Q&A, Fragen und Antworten, uns jederzeit Fragen zu stellen, die wir dann versuchen werden, im Webinar am Schluss zu beantworten. Sie können auch, wenn Sie das Webinar in einer anderen Sprache übersetzt anzeigen wollen, können Sie die Live-Untertitel oder auf Englisch Captions einschalten in der Sprache Ihrer Wahl, solange die Sprache Deutsch oder Französisch ist. Wir werden dieses Webinar aufnehmen und auch dann nach dem Webinar ab morgen zur Verfügung stellen als Recording, dass Sie das auch Ihren Mitgliedern in Ihrer Unternehmen und Ihrer Organisation dann weitergeben können. Und ja, natürlich verwenden wir Teams, um dieses Webinar zu übertragen. 2, 3 Worte vorneweg, auf einem Slide nur. CYCL ist eine Lifetiles Company. Wir gehören zum weltweiten Lifetiles Konzern. Lifetiles ist eine Firma, die spezialisiert ist auf Digital Workplace Technologie. Angefangen bei Intranet, Mitarbeiterkommunikations-Apps, aber auch die Office 365 Plattform als solche, wie zum Beispiel Teams, deswegen auch dieses Webinar. Lifetiles ist weltweit vertreten, mit mittlerweile über 1200 Kunden weltweit. Ja, und noch einige kurze Auszeichnungen, auf die wir natürlich stolz sind. Wir sind Goldpartner, 7-fach hier in der Schweiz, aber auch weltweit, wurden von Gartner in den letzten Wochen 2-mal ausgezeichnet, einmal als Cool Vendor und auch von Forrester als Intranet Vendor, einer der Top 20. Gut, aber nun zum Thema. Security and Governance, warum wichtig? Covid hat uns einiges beschert an Neuigkeiten und an Neuigkeiten auch, wie wir miteinander arbeiten, wie wir mehr remote arbeiten, mehr von zu Hause arbeiten. Das hat aber auch eine Kehrseite gehabt. Ein dieser Quotes hier von Checkpoint Software, eine Firma, die spezialisiert ist auf Security, digitale Security im Web, aber auch auf dem Desktop für Unternehmen, die Hacking-Versuche, Phishing-Versuche oder Malware-Versuche rund um das Thema Coronavirus sind natürlich auch in dieser Zeit, seit Februar, März, sprunghaft angestiegen. Nicht zuletzt auch, weil natürlich auch die Anzahl von Remote-Mitarbeitern oder Remote-Teilnehmern an Teams, an Webinaren wie dieses hier, aber vor allem auch an Videokonferenzen stark gestiegen ist. Die Anzahl von Dokumenten, die geteilt werden übers Web, ist stark gestiegen. Es gibt natürlich auch mehr Angriffsfläche für nicht so koschere Versuche, mit ihnen in Kontakt zu treten. Deswegen ist das Thema Security and Governance rund um das Thema Teams ein sehr, sehr wichtiges und immer wichtiger geworden oder immer aktueller geworden in den letzten Wochen. Wir haben zu der Reihe, deswegen zu Teams, auch verschiedene Inhalte auf unserem Internet publiziert. Eines davon ist ein E-Book zu typischen Fehlern bei der Teams-Einführung, wenn es darum geht, wie man wirklich auch zu einer maximalen Adoption geht, wie man Teams wirklich auch als Change-Projekt einführt und welche Infrastruktur es auf Office 365 braucht. Aber das Thema Teams, Security and Governance ist eigentlich ein eigenes Thema. Deswegen haben wir auch dieses eigene Webinar aufgesetzt, das ein bisschen tiefer gehen soll und Ihnen auch aufzeigen soll, sehr konkret am Produkt, im Produkt drin, in Teams, was man alles tun kann. Einerseits auf der User-Seite, auf der Business-Seite, aber logischerweise auch auf der Technologie-Seite. Deswegen möchte ich jetzt meine kleine Einleitung hier schon beenden und das Wort übergeben an Michele, der uns durch dieses Thema durchführt. Michele, danke dir.
Thank you very much, Urs. And we'll make a quick language switch so that the webinar doesn't take 2 hours. I will keep it nice and short. And thank you for participating in this, for the people that managed to make some time. I'm really excited to present the security and compliance section for Teams, and I'm really confident you will get something good out of it. A couple of slides just to set the theme. So we will look at the content of this webinar into, let's say, through 3 lenses, right? One is the user lens, obviously, which involves some level of adoption, as we will see. Then there are the business decisions that need to be made, and so that involves governance and also, involving the IT strategy as well, and the technical level. So how do we really set up the features that we decide to implement. Now, a couple of points for each of these pillars. It's obviously known that the security has always been managed by IT, but contrary to the normal belief, there are some security features that are available in Teams, and I think it's okay that users are able to leverage these features as long as they understand what they are and how to use them. I think one of the key part of the modern workplace is that users can really improve their productivity and be a little bit more agile, also by managing some level of security in the application that it's being provided to them. And we will see exactly how. So the business level, as I mentioned before, it's really the decision that needs to be made of what should be implemented as an organization. And obviously the first questions that come into play are, what are the legal and regulatory requirements for the organization? Is it something that it's really needed, or it's something that it's a nice to have? And I guess the goal is always to find that right balance between, okay, we give the users really the ability to use our tools, and at the same time, we want to implement some governance that does not restrict them too much. And maybe on this point, many companies, they're really embracing their values and their culture to really reflect the way they implement governance. So companies that are really open, in their culture and really inclusive, they are unlikely to impose really strict measures on how users can really utilize their features in their applications. And the last part, as I mentioned before, it involves a little bit of infrastructure, foundation. You require an Azure tenant, some licensing. Do you have the right devices, computers that are really up to date, that are really supporting the new technologies? Do you need to manage also mobile devices? Do you need to manage applications on mobile devices? And then there are things like multi-factor authentication that it sits in between, let's say, Azure and 365. And obviously more technical parts which involve, for example, a migration. If you need to move your files from a file share to your Teams, you obviously need technical implementation and a proper plan. Speaking of implementation, Urs in the end will also talk a little bit of how we at LiveTiles, we really deliver this type of project for Teams from the very beginning when we do an analysis until the very end, where we focus a lot on the user adoption, because that's really the key. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into those 3 pillars. The first one, it's about the user. And if you have been using Teams so far, you might know some of these features, but I'm also sure that I will be showing some new options that are coming up or that Microsoft will make available soon. The first one is the meeting option. So whenever you create a meeting, you will find a link to the option either in your Outlook invite or in your Teams calendar. And this allows you to include or to choose who, for example, can bypass the lobby. By default, for example, all the people in your organization can join a meeting directly. However, people outside the organization or someone that calls in via phone, they will need to be admitted by the organizer, by yourself, if you have organized a meeting. Obviously, who can present? This is quite straightforward. And this one here is a new feature that's going to be rolled out in the next weeks. At the moment, whenever you schedule a team meeting, the chat is allowed before, during, and after the meeting, which is great because you can really have all the conversation in one spot. But with this new feature, you can limit the chat to happen, for example, only during the meeting, only before, only after. So you have more control over this. The roles that you have when you organize the meetings are quite straightforward. If you do use live events like we are doing at the moment, you will have an additional role which is called the producer. So you have someone who organizes the meeting, someone who really starts the event in terms of live meetings. Then you can have multiple presenters and also multiple attendees. The next feature that I find really interesting is actually an upgrade that is going to be rolled out soon, and it's about the meetings recording. So if you have ever recorded a meeting, and by the way, not just the organizer can record a meeting, but also presenters, as long as they are in the same organization. But if you have done that, you have probably noticed that the recording has been stored in Microsoft Stream, which is also part of 365. And that's all good until you have tried to share this recording with someone outside the organization, and you've probably been frustrated by the fact that you cannot, because Stream does not allow sharing outside the organization. And this is one of the reasons why also Microsoft is now moving the recording from Stream to SharePoint and OneDrive. So if you record a meeting that occurs in a channel, that meeting will be stored in SharePoint, because that's where all the content for a team resides. On the other hand, if you have a one-on-one meeting, or if you create a meeting, from your Outlook, so outside the channel, that recording will be stored in your OneDrive. And so why is it important? Two main reasons. One, as I mentioned before, you will be able now to share this recording with people outside the organization using the now standard sharing window that is available in SharePoint and OneDrive. You probably have seen this because it's a very interesting and an easy way to share content within those two platforms. But additionally, why it's also good is because if you have some of the compliance and security feature, which you will see in the next section, this will also apply to the recordings that are stored in Teams and OneDrive, because Stream is not part of the location where these policies that we will see soon can be applied to. So this is very interesting, and it will be rolled out in the next months. And there is also an option to opt in or opt out. If you're not an administrator, you can look up this information. Similarly, a feature that it's not really something that you can control. It's the recording consent, and something that appears on the top bar that you can dismiss as a user, and where you can also put actually your privacy consent as part of the organization as an administrator. But the real feature that a user can manage as part of security within Teams is the ability to create private teams. This is more a privacy feature as opposed to a public team where everybody in the organization can join. And then you can also create private channels. So if you have 10 members in a team, you can create a private channel and say only 5 of those 10 members can access this channel. Then we also have something called channel moderation that I will show you shortly in a slide. And then we have a topic that is really something that can be treated by itself. It's external access. We've talked about this in other webinars, and we also have some content on our blog. So if you're interested, look that up. But in essence, the simplest example is that as a team owner, you can invite someone externally of the organization, and so you can have guests in your team. There are also other variation of external access, and you can find them in those blogs and webinars. And finally, as a team owner, you can really manage permissions and other settings for the team. For example, you can decide which permissions your members are going to have, and also if you want to elevate the permission of your guest. These are the default ones. Lastly, I will just mention the channel moderation, which is the ability for you to create a channel where the members can either read only, or they can interact with the posts, but they cannot create new posts. So this is exactly this option that you have here. So you can either allow members to reply to messages that have been posted by moderators, or they cannot reply at all, so you can use it as an announcement channel. As a team owner, you can decide who the moderators are. They don't have to necessarily to be the team owners. You can define other members. And so this is also another way to control the security and the privacy of your channel, and you can apply this setting per channel as well. Okay. The next section is really the core of this webinar, and this is really where the most interesting part is coming in. I will just say that all these features that I have mentioned in this slide, they are part of the so-called Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance Center. And although they are not specifically created for Teams, we will see that we can configure them to really look for Teams content and Teams chat. So keep in mind that you can apply them to other services. We'll see in a moment, but I will try to focus really on what we can do within Teams. Now, on that note, I just have this slide that it's not meant to be technical at all, but I just want you to understand that we have two different types of content in Teams. One is the chat, and it runs. There is a service that runs in Azure. It doesn't really matter, but all the chat that happens, being it's a group chat, a one-on-one chat, or a channel messages, they are all stored in Microsoft Exchange, right? So either in the user mailbox or in the group mailbox. Let's not get into the details. On the other hand, if you have files stored in Teams, they will be stored either in SharePoint or in OneDrive. So Teams per se does not store any content, but it leverages Exchange Online and SharePoint and OneDrive to really store the content. So messages and chat in Exchange, all the file SharePoint and OneDrive. And that's exactly where the Security and Compliance Center really gets the information from. And lastly, before we get into the the really features, I just want to mention that this topic really pushes us to think a little bit differently on what the typical administrator can do, because we think that the administrator should do everything in terms of security and compliance and configuration and user and so on. But it's very likely that in the organization nowadays there is an administrator for SharePoint, maybe one for Exchange, one for Azure, 365, and so on. The point that I want to make here is that the administrator is not necessarily the person who needs to take care about the security and compliance policies and regulation in 365. So we have all these different areas, and for each of these areas, we can define different roles. So we can have someone that investigates a particular case, someone that does an analysis, and someone that decides what to do. And so the way Microsoft has structured this is that for each of these area, you can define multiple roles. You don't have to. You can have one role for compliance, one role for data investigation, and so on. But just to understand that the burden is not on the administrator, we can really scale this depending on the size of the organization. Okay. Let's get into it. The first feature that I want to show you is called sensitivity labels. And what it does when we really focus on team, it controls the privacy of team. So is it a public or a private team? And it also controls the guest settings. So if you are allowed to have external users or not. It can also be applied to file and emails, where you can apply encryption and watermark. But let's first see how this, it really works in practice in Teams. So I have here one of my test user. This is a typical team. It's on the web, and I will try to create a team in here. And so essentially what the sensitivity label here is, it's really a drop down. So in really layman's term, but as you can see here, I have 3 options. I have something called general use, and if I select this, I'm only allowed to select a public team. And public team, just to remind you, means that everybody in the organization can join the team. However, if I choose another option called commercial in confidence, I can only create a private team. And the same applies to confidential. If I choose a confidential sensitivity label, I can only create a private team. However, there is a difference between these two. So in commercial in confidence, here I have a little wording saying this content can be shared with restricted partners. It means that if I do create a team with this sensitivity label, I will be able to invite guests. So to have people outside the organization. On the other hand, if I choose confidential, I will not be able to invite guests in this team. That's really the essence of it. And you can really use the combination of these features to really decide what you want to have. Additionally, you can also decide what to do with unmanaged devices. So it means devices that are not managed by the organization, if you want them to have full access, limited access, or block the access. And lastly, I will also show you how this really works. Just quickly, this is an example of a sensitivity label that has been applied to a file. In this case, the sensitivity label is called confidential finance. And as you can see here, there is a watermark applied to the file, meaning that we want to put something on it to remind the user that it's really confidential. I will show you just quickly how one of these labels work. So the confidential finance here, it's actually one that is targeted specifically for the file and an email, which I just showed you. And you will see that I have a number of options here, which includes the encryption. I can decide to encrypt the file. I can decide to assign specific permission. And then I can decide to have the watermark. And here is exactly what you've seen. You can put the text, you can decide the font size, and you can decide on the layout of the watermark. So quite some options here as well. And to show you the other one that we had before for the teams, this was the commercial in confidence. This applies to the team, which, underlying, it's actually groups inside. But you see that here, oops. See if this comes up properly. This is the one. And so we don't do anything with files, but we do decide the privacy. So in this case, you see that I have decided the team to be private, and I do allow for external user access, which is the difference between this policy and the confidential one where this tick box is not checked. Okay, so this is a sensitivity label, and maybe just lastly, I will also show you that you can also apply the sensitivity label as part of the document because it's integrated with the Office app. And so as a user, you can also apply the label. And if you do so, then you will get the watermark and those additional permissions and encryption that I just showed you. Okay. Next one up is retention. So retention means that you can either retain files for a specific number of time, let's say a number of years, or you want to delete files. So in essence, this is the two options that you have. You can also combine them. You can say, I want to retain this financial or legal content for 2 years, and after that, I want to delete it. And so you can do this by basing yourself on the file creation, on the file modification. You can assign it to users or groups, and also to specifically to Teams chat and channels. This is important to understand that even if a user deletes or modifies the files, they are not actually deleted, because once you have a retention policy or label on it, then it will be stored in the backend additionally, so that you can go back and restore it, not restore it, but access it as a backend compliance manager, for example. There are really two types of retention. One is the policy that applies to a whole site. Let's imagine that you have a team or a SharePoint site where the content needs to be retained for the same amount of time, let's say 2 or 5 years. Then it's easy. You apply policy and all the content gets the same retention. On the other hand, if you need to apply the retention for different items, so on a folder, on document level, or on an email, you are better off using a label. And the label can be set manually, or they can be set automatically. So you can say, if the content contains, let's say, a bank account or a credit card, then I need to retain it, and I want this to happen automatically. I will just quickly show also how this can happen or can be done manually. So here I'm in a SharePoint site, but it could be, also a file in Teams, and you can see here that as a user, I can apply a retention label. So it means here you also see that I have employee records retained forever, personal identifiable information for 3 years, and so on. So where you don't have a policy that applies to the whole site, as a user, you have ability to apply the retention yourself. Excellent. So let's move on to the next one, which is
Michele,
probably the...
Michele,
Yes.
if I may, I think it's good to take a few questions right now, because they were on the topic sensitivity, I think.
Absolutely.
One was, if you don't mind, will sensitivity labels be automatically applied to files in a team? Is there any inheritance rules?
Very good question. Not by default. So I will actually show you shortly that you can apply them automatically if you want, or you can decide to let user apply them like I just show you now. So in that case, it's for the retention, but it also applies to the sensitivity. So in this case, I can apply a sensitivity label manually, or I can, as an administrator or let's say a compliance manager or a compliance administrator, decide to apply that label or policy to the whole team or to the whole SharePoint site. Now, if you're not aware, when I say SharePoint site and team, it's really the same thing, because like I mentioned before, Teams does not store itself any content. The content of a team is stored in SharePoint. So I'm using these two wording interchangeably, because when we're talking about security and compliance, as you will see in a moment, the location is where it matters, where you apply it. So to answer your question, you can do it automatically, or you can also have it manually.
Thank you. Let's move on with data loss prevention.
Excellent. So yeah, I was about to say that this is really interesting, because it's probably one of the most flexible and really comprehensive feature that I found in the Security and Compliance Center. And so the idea behind data loss prevention is really to protect the sensitive information from either an inadvertent disclosure or something that is maybe malicious, someone that wants to do it on purpose. And we will see that there are different types of sensitive information. It can be financial data, or it could be something called personal identifiable information. It could be, credit card, bank accounts, security numbers, social security numbers, and so on. And I will show you that there are some predefined ones. As you can see here, these are templates, but you can also define your own. And then you can decide, what are we going to do with this information, right? So if we identify it, we can decide to encrypt it, or we can define to prevent the sharing inside or outside the organization. And here, again, this is what I mentioned before. This is a feature of 365, but we can really target Teams as a specific location for the policy that we are going to construct. So I'm going to quickly show you the policy, and then I also show you how the policy works in action. So because we are located in Switzerland, here I made a test with the Swiss security number, and I'm going to show you how this policy looks like. So I have chosen, so Swiss security number, it's something that is available on one of those default sensitive information. See if we are able to bring this up. And unfortunately, Switzerland has only one of these out-of-the-box information. Some countries have at least 2 or 3. They have the driver's license, they have, for example, bank account. But for Switzerland, for the moment, only the AHV is available. Okay, let's give it another try. If this one comes up. Because this is really important, how we can understand the real flexibility of it. Maybe I will just start mentioning while this one loads. So we choose the sensitivity information, which is in this case the AHV. The AHV has a specific pattern, and so there is also some kind of accuracy that you can define if this pattern is recognized. And it's not that you can just put in any random number with the same number of digits. It really needs to match a specific dictionary. So here is the location, like I mentioned before, but let's get into the core of the policy. Exactly here, the sensitive information that I've chosen here is the AHV, which is part of this out-of-the-box predefined content. Here you see you have identity card, identification text number, and so on. But you can also define your own. And so in this policy, I'm defining that I want to identify when this type of content is shared outside my organization. And then what are we going to do? We are going to restrict the content and with the people outside the organization. I'm going to show you how that works, but then you can also use a notification. You want to inform your users so that they can be educated. You can use policy tips that will be displayed when a user tries to do that, and then you can notify a number of people, the person who sent or shared a file, additional owners. You can customize the email. This is the policy tip that I mentioned. You can also provide a user override, which I'm going to show you as well. So what does this mean? It means, okay, we have identified that you are trying to share this information, but instead of blocking it, we are letting you override this option and still going ahead. And this is really, for me, the ultimate point that demonstrates that flexibility of finding the right balance between giving the agility to the users and still applying some level of governance. And so you can see that you really can do a number of things here as well, including providing incident report where those investigators and analysts can really get into. So this is the policy itself. Let's see it in action. So what I've done here, I've created a document which has exactly a couple of AHV inside. And first of all, you see that there is a little red mark, a little red circle there. But if I do select the documents, I get this policy tip already, and it tells me that this file contains the Swiss Social Security number. So it has been identified. The user has been informed here. And then if I'm trying to share this with someone outside the organization, let's see if I still have my outside of user, you see that I do get this message. This item contains sensitive information. It can be shared with people outside the organization. So this is really the policy in place. And I think this is really flexible and really cool what you can do. And this is one example. The other one that I mentioned before is that you can use that override option, which is here, which I have used in a different policy, and that policy is also applied to this file. So this policy is different. It does not look for AHV, but in this case, it found US social security number. This is the equivalent for the US. But you see that here I have an override option, and this is exactly what I mentioned before. I can say, okay, I'm aware of this, and I still want to go ahead, and then I can share the file. And this is really important because I guess, like to reiterate, it really makes the user aware, but it also makes the user responsible and accountable for what they do, right? And all this is recorded. For example, I might be able to show you here real quick. I have it opened exactly here, right? So there is a section for reports about DLP, And this is one of the reports that shows us the DLP policy override. And this, I can see that the other day, this policy were overridden, and this is the justification that the user provided. I am aware of this. I'm sharing this with my finance manager, right? So it's really, you can really follow the chain, and really, it's not left to the administrator saying, oh, well, someone who has shared this file, how can I find it? Do I have to go through the logs? No, you really have the measures in place that allows you to have full control of this, at the same time giving the flexibility to the users. All right, I'm gonna quickly switch back to the other options because we have a couple more things to show. The communication compliance is a relatively new feature that has been rolled out in the last 6 months, and to some extent, it really overlaps a little bit with the DLP, but the difference is that you don't take straight actions like blocking content. On the other hand, you can assign reviewers, and they can decide what to do with that type of content. So let me show you this, how it works. So here I have the communication compliance, and one of the new features that's been rolled out is really to monitor for offensive or threatening language, right? So in this case, the policy, which is also an out-of-the-box one, excuse me if I manage to just select it and show how it works. So obviously there are a number of predefined policy here, but in essence, you can define the user that you want to supervise, or the groups. In this case, I want to really look for these 2 users, and I want to assign someone that is going to review once this policy or the communication has been found. In this case, I want to monitor only the messages between these 2 users, or the number of users, if you want, that happen in Teams. And I can define what type of communication: internal, outbound, inbound, outbound, or only internal. And this is exactly then what you can define. So in this case, there is something called trainable classifier, which is something that is it's already provided by Microsoft. But obviously, as you can imagine, it's about machine learning. You can train this classifier. You can create your own, or you can create. You can add a number of additional rules. So the message contains some specific words, attachment size, message size, or additionally, you can specify again those sensitivity info types. So that's where maybe the overlap happens. But in this case, you can really create multiple variation of this content. So this is the communication compliance. I will quickly show you also something about the logs, which I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in. So the logs is about to find specific activities that have happened in 365, and there is a whole section dedicated to Teams, and so you can find who created the team, who deleted the channel. As you can see here, the options are many, and you can find them in this audit log search if you are an administrator. And as I mentioned before, there is a section for Teams, but here you can search for different activities in all the 365 services. And you can create alerts as well. Here, for example, I've created an alert for every time a team is created. On the other hand, you have something called content search. And in this case, we're not looking for activities, but we are looking for content. And so you can define, again, a number of conditions to look for. In this case, I was looking for a specific word, and then this word, I can get a report that it happened in specific Teams chat messages, or also in file attachments that were exchanged into emails. So I will not go into many details for search, but I will just show you here that you can search in Exchange, and this comes back to what I was explaining before. So you either search in Exchange or you either search in SharePoint, because Teams content, it's stored in those 2 locations, so Teams messages or Teams site. So if you want to take it to the next level, there is something called insider risk, and it does work in conjunction with DLP, but this is where you can really create cases, and you can really assign different people to what they will do. And on top of the DLP, I will just mention that you can take this to the next level, because you can hook up this particular feature with, for example, your HR system, and you can say, Well, if I have someone that is leaving, a person that is leaving really in the next few months, I can monitor their activity. So here you see that there is something called data theft by departing users, or then you can have other data leaks. And so if you have this connection, you can really start being a little bit more specific. And something that is still in preview, but you can really monitor if someone is copying a file to a USB drive, if they are mounting USB drive, they are transferring. So you can really get into the hardening part of controlling how the information is really potentially leaking in the organization. So this is really the I think the power of what you can do with all this sensitivity information. And there is one more part that I will just that I will not get into. It's called communication barriers, where basically you can prevent two different departments or business unit to really communicate between each other. So you can think about, insider trading or really big departments that cannot communicate in larger organization. So the third pillar, so we have done the user, we've done the business, and this is the technical. I will just shortly mention that this is mostly related to, I would say, Azure configuration. So your multi-factor authentication. For example, you might want to, control if a user is logging in from a device or from an IP or a location that is unknown or outside the organization, that you can challenge them and say, okay, you need to provide a multi-factor authentication. Otherwise, you can really manage devices, so mobile devices. You can get into the advanced threat protection by checking attachments in emails. This is now called Microsoft Defender. In terms of encryption, there is not much we can do. This is provided by Microsoft behind the scene. But if you read some reports, you can probably understand that this is quite robust, as opposed to something like Zoom that in the past has gone through quite some flaws that have been reported by many security firms. I will only mention the data residency in this section, and it's about where your data is located. So if your tenant has been created in the last year, your data is probably located in Switzerland, but if it's not, it probably resides in the European Union. And maybe something that it's little known is that a stream does not show in this data location panel that you can see in the 365 center. You have to go to stream, and you have to, go on the question mark and about to find where it is stored. Just be aware that even though your data, your Exchange and SharePoint and Teams data is stored in Switzerland, your Teams is not, because it's not available yet. However, it might not be a big concern, because as I mentioned earlier, the recordings will be moving from Streams to SharePoint and OneDrive. So just to recap, the features that we have seen for users, they're really empowering the user to manage some of the security in their team. Important to make them aware, of course. The business, where you need the decision to be made of what features are available and what you need to implement in according also to your IT strategy. And the last one is more the technical part, where you want to control location, device security, data residency, and the likes. I just have 2 slides to conclude before I give it back to Urs. And one is really something to consider. I mentioned this before. Is it a requirement, or is it nice to have? Do you legally need to have your data in Switzerland, or is it okay for the moment to still have it in the EU until Microsoft moves it? What are the risks of not implementing some of these features? Yeah, do you have previous data leakage or data or sensitivity data that has been incorrectly handled in your organization? The costs, obviously, I haven't mentioned this, but the Security and Compliance Center requires an E5 license, which might have some cost implication. You can also consider third-party solution. Resources and know-how, as I mentioned, you don't necessarily have to put all the burdens on an administrator. You probably require a specific personnel that handles the compliance and security in 365. And lastly, but not least, I think user is really the key. Despite being this security and compliance focus, it doesn't matter where the technology is, the users is really need to be involved in training and adoption. And for this reason, I'm leaving you with this quote. You can give users the best software that you want, the best rated and the best on the market, but there is no such thing as it has to be intuitive so that there is no training required. And that is why we really focus a lot in our implementation in user training, change management, and adoption. And with this, I will thank you very much for being here today. I will hang around for the Q&A, but I will give back for the last couple of minutes to Urs.
Danke dir, Michele. Damit switchen wir wieder zurück zu Deutsch. Ich möchte Ihnen jetzt in den letzten Minuten noch ganz kurz einen Einblick geben, was wir alles als CYCL für unseren Kunden rund um das Thema Teams tun können. Wie Michele eben schon erwähnt hat, ist eine erfolgreiche Teams-Einführung oder ein erfolgreicher Einsatz von Teams heißt auch immer, dass man sich ja wirklich um den ganzen Lebenszyklus von Collaboration kümmert. Der geht über genau zu verstehen, was wirklich Teams erreichen kann mit einer Envisioning-Phase, Planung der eigentlichen Einführung bis hin zu Maßnahmen, um User Adoption zu maximieren. Dazu haben wir verschiedene Sachen zusammengestellt für all diese Phasen. Fängt an bei Gratis-Tools, die wir zur Verfügung stellen, wenn es darum geht, bestimmt die besten Use Cases oder die wichtigsten Use Cases zu beschreiben beim Einsatz von Teams. Geht weiter über auch ein wirkliches Planungssystem und Planungstools, für was, wen Teams wie eingesetzt werden kann und was das bedeutet. Zum Beispiel eben auch zu Security und Governance Einstellungen. Geht über dann natürlich zu bestimmten Maßnahmen, die wir auch tun können, um ihr Intranet mit Teams zu verschmelzen. Etwas, was wir sehr häufig jetzt für Kunden auch tun dürfen, weil ja sehr viele von diesen Benutzern, die früher morgens auf dem Internet eingestiegen sind, heute in Teams einsteigen. Wie bringt man diese beiden Welten zusammen, sodass der User keinen Switch machen muss von einer App zur anderen App oder einem Browser, sondern alles an einem Ort verfindet. Dazu haben wir auch einige Apps gebaut, so unter anderem auch für Unternehmenskommunikatoren, Marcom, HR. Wie bringe ich Unternehmenskommunikation auf die App, aber auch in Teams an einem Ort. Ja, kontaktieren Sie uns, damit wir Ihnen ein bisschen detaillierter auch aufzeigen können, was alles hier von Lifetiles und CYCL zur Verfügung steht. Das führt mich eigentlich jetzt noch kurz zu einem Überblick neben diesem Webinar. Wir haben auch noch 2 weitere Webinare ähnlich zu diesem Security and Governance Webinar geplant in diesem Herbst. Auch diese sind eher wieder nicht auf End-User, sondern auf Power-User, Administratoren oder Projektleiter geplant zu den beiden Themen Adoption und Governance. 2 Themen, die eigentlich uns sehr, sehr stark bei Kundenprojekten beschäftigen. Deswegen haben wir nochmal 2 neue Webinare aufgelegt, ähnlich dem Webinar hier mit Michele, die ein bisschen tiefer gehen, wie man Adoption plant und wie man die ganze Governance-Settings eigentlich auch aufstellt. Rechts auf dem Slide habe ich noch ganz kurz dargestellt gehabt, wir haben auch mehrere andere, danke Michele, wir haben auch andere Webinare, die wir auf unserer Webseite Ihnen gerne zur Verfügung stellen, wenn es um das Thema First-Line User oder First-Line-Worker geht, also Mitarbeiter, die draußen sind, die nicht Zugang haben vielleicht zu einem Intranet, die auch vielleicht nicht einmal eine Corporate E-Mail-Adresse haben. Wie kann man die einbetten in ihren digitalen Arbeitsplatz? Dazu haben wir einige Apps, haben wir verschiedene Tools und Services, die wir anbieten können, um zum Beispiel für Unternehmen, die in der Baubranche sind, in der Hotellerie oder in anderen Branchen, die sehr viele auswärtige Mitarbeiter einbetten müssen. Ja, und last but not least, ich habe Sie jetzt hier schon im Chat eingestellt, unsere Webinarreihe On Demand steht für Sie natürlich auch zur Verfügung. Zu verschiedenen Themen haben wir über das ganze Jahr immer wieder neue Webinare aufgenommen. Die stehen Ihnen auf unserer Webseite zur Verfügung. Ich habe Ihnen einen direkten Link dazu auch hier in das Q&A-Fenster gestellt. Ja, herzlichen Dank, dass Sie uns begleitet haben zu diesem Webinar und herzlichen Dank auch an Michele. Und ja, dann bleibt mir eigentlich nur noch Ihnen einen schönen, wunderbaren Abend zu wünschen und dann hoffentlich sehr bald auch ein schönes Wochenende. Herzlichen Dank.